Somewhere inside your body, right now, there's a growth hormone receptor that a Neanderthal carried 47,000 years ago. Somewhere in your immune system, there may be a gene that helped a Neanderthal survive winters you will never have to face. And somewhere buried in a cave in Poland, scientists just found a group of Neanderthals so isolated, so genetically distinct, that they appear to have been living an entirely separate story from every other Neanderthal population known to science. For decades, the story was simple. Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago, and modern human took over the planet alone. New DNA evidence says that story was never complete, and what it replaces it with is stranger than extinction. This is not fringe theory. The research behind this comes from some of the most rigorously peer-reviewed institutions working in ancient genetics today. Svante Pääbo of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology won the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine specifically for sequencing the Neanderthal genome, the foundational work that made everything that follows possible. Since then, teams at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Rochester, and the University of California, Berkeley, have all published findings in journals including Science and Nature that build directly on that foundation. This isn't a single study making a bold claim. It's a widening body of published, replicated science, and it keeps pointing in the same direction. It helps to remember just how recent all of this actually is. For most of the 20th century, Neanderthals were studied almost entirely through bones and stone tools, which meant every conclusion about their relationship to modern humans was really just an educated guess dressed up as consensus. That changed in 2010 when Pääbo's team published the first complete Neanderthal nuclear genome, giving scientists an actual side-by-side genetic comparison for the first time in history. Everything covered in this video sits downstream of that single breakthrough. 15 years later, the technology for reading ancient degraded DNA has become precise enough to detect patterns that were completely invisible to the researchers who made the first breakthrough. Patterns hiding in plain sight inside every human genome sequenced since. Before going further, it helps to understand what extinction actually means in genetics, because the word carries an assumption that doesn't always hold up. Picture a river that flows into a larger river downstream. If you stood at the confluence point and watched the smaller river's water mix completely into the larger one, you might say the smaller river disappeared. But that's not quite right. Its water didn't vanish. It became part of the larger river, indistinguishable on the surface, but chemically still there if you know how to test for it. That is essentially what happened to Neanderthals. As a distinct, separate population with their own culture and territory, they did stop existing. But genetically, a portion of them flowed directly into us, and it never fully washed out. Here's the number that makes this concrete, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the foundation everything else in this story builds on. Today, nearly every person on Earth whose ancestry traces outside of Africa carries somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. To understand what that actually looks like, picture a single teaspoon of Neanderthal ancestry stirred into a full bathtub of modern human DNA. Small enough that you'd never taste it directly, but present in every single cup you pour out of that tub, generation after generation, for over 40,000 years. Now stack a second comparison on top of that. If your entire genetic code were rewritten as a 3 billion word book, roughly 30 to 60s, a million of those words would have been written originally by a Neanderthal. That's not a footnote. That's several chapters. Researchers at the University of Rochester, working alongside colleagues at the Max Planck Institute and UC Berkeley, published a pair of studies in Science and Nature that pinned down exactly when this mixing happened with more precision than ever before. Led by Benjamin Peter, the team analyzed 58 ancient Eurasian genomes alongside modern human DNA, and determined that the interbreeding window began around 50,500 years ago and lasted roughly 7,000 years, ending only as Neanderthal populations themselves began to vanish. Our study provides the most detailed insights yet into how Neanderthal gene flow impacted human genomes, Peter explained. That 7,000-year overlap means modern humans and Neanderthals didn't brush past each other in some brief accidental encounter. They lived alongside one another in the same landscapes for longer than the entire span of recorded human history that followed. Now, here's where the story stops being about timing and starts being about something far stranger. The mixing wasn't even. For more than 2 decades, geneticists had puzzled over a strange gap in the data, the near total absence of Neanderthal DNA on the human X chromosome, a pattern that showed up consistently no matter which modern population researchers examined. Earlier, theories assumed this was simple, natural selection, quietly erasing incompatible genes over thousands of generations, the genetic equivalent of a biological error being corrected over time. In February 2026, a team led by Alexander Platt, Daniel Harris, and Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania published a study in Science that finally tested that assumption directly. by flipping the question around and checking for modern human DNA inside Neanderthal genomes instead of the other way around. 62% excess of modern human DNA on their X chromosomes compared to their other chromosomes. 62%. That is not a rounding error in ancient genetics. That is a signal too large to explain away as background noise. What we found was a striking imbalance, said team member Daniel Harris. The imbalance wasn't about incompatibility at all. It pointed towards something almost entirely social. The interbreeding was heavily sex-biased, driven overwhelmingly by Neanderthal males and modern human females, a pattern of ancient social interaction now written directly into the genome itself, invisible for 20 years, simply because nobody had thought to look at the data from the Neanderthal side of the equation. Let's pause here and restack what's actually been established, because there's a second thread about to open up that connects directly back to this one. Neanderthals and modern humans overlapped for roughly 7,000 years, ending around 40,000 years ago. During that overlap, 1 to 2% of their genetic material was absorbed permanently into the human gene pool. And the way that absorption happened wasn't random pairing. It followed a distinct sex-biased social pattern, most likely shaped by which group's descendants were raised within which community. That's 3 separate, independently confirmed findings, each peer-reviewed, each pointing toward the same underlying reality. This wasn't a clean species replacement. It was a slow, socially structured merger. In the next part of this, we get into what that merger is still doing inside your body, right now, tens of thousands of years later. That question, what is it still doing, is exactly what a 2026 study on the growth hormone receptor gene, known as GHR, set out to answer. Researchers found that a Neanderthal-derived version of this gene is associated with measurable differences in body development among modern humans who carry it. This isn't a gene sitting dormant, has ancient junk in the background of your DNA. It's active, expressed, and shaping physical traits in living people today, inherited in an unbroken line from a species that supposedly disappeared 40,000 years ago. And it isn't an isolated case. Earlier research had already established that Neanderthal-derived genes influence immune response, skin tone, and hair color in modern populations, with some variants even shown to affect susceptibility to certain viral infections. The genome didn't just preserve a few random leftover fragments. It preserved functioning biology, still doing a job, generation after generation. If that sounds abstract, one example makes it concrete, in a way most people can immediately relate to. Geneticists Hugo Zyberg and Svante Pääbo published research showing that a cluster of genes on chromosome 3, inherited directly from Neanderthals, was linked to a significantly higher risk of severe illness during the COVID-19 pandemic. A real measurable health outcome, playing out in hospitals in 2020 and 2021, traceable directly back to a piece of DNA that entered the human gene pool tens of thousands of years earlier. That single finding reframes the entire conversation. This isn't ancient history sitting quietly in a museum display case. It is active biology, still influencing who gets sicker and who doesn't, in the middle of events happening within living memory. Here's the part that connects everything discovered so far to something even bigger. In July 2026, researchers at UC Berkeley published a new technique that goes beyond Neanderthals and Denisovans entirely. By analyzing hundreds of modern human genomes for shared genealogical patterns, the team identified DNA segments inherited from what they describe as 2 additional, previously unidentified ancient human relatives. Genetic ghosts whose fossils have never been found, but whose presence is unmistakable in the DNA of people alive today. In other words, Neanderthals were never the only ancient population absorbed into modern humanity. They were simply the first one we had a name for. Think about what that actually implies. Every conversation about human origins for the last 15 years has essentially been a 3-way story. Modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, mixing together somewhere in the deep past. The Berkeley technique suggests that story was always incomplete, not because the science was wrong, but because the tools available couldn't see far enough back to detect the other participants. If 2 more ancient populations are hiding inside modern DNA, and nobody even knew to look for them until now, the honest answer to how many ancient human groups contributed to who we are today might not be a settled number at all. It might just be the highest number anyone has managed to detect so far, with better tools than the ones after them. And the story of who Neanderthals even were keeps getting more complicated the closer scientists look. In April 2026, researchers from the University of Bologna, examining Stajnia Cave in Poland, recovered what they describe as the first multi-individual set of Neanderthal metagenomes found north of the Carpathian Mountains. The genetic signatures from this site revealed a group of Neanderthals distinct enough from other known populations that researchers now describe them as a hidden lineage, effectively frozen in time in a corner of Europe that had never been genetically sampled before. Neanderthals, it turns out, weren't one uniform population slowly fading into obscurity. They were multiple distinct communities, some of which we are only now discovering existed at all, each potentially carrying its own unique genetic contribution to the humans who came after them. If this is the kind of history that gets left out of most textbooks, it's worth staying for the rest of this, because the full picture only gets sharper from here. Let's restack again, because this is the point in the story where all of these threads finally braid together into the headline claim. Neanderthals overlapped with modern humans for thousands of years. Their DNA entered the human gene pool through a socially structured, sex-biased pattern of interbreeding. That inherited DNA is not inert. It is still actively shaping traits like growth, immune response, and disease susceptibility in living people today. And Neanderthals themselves were not one population, but several, some of which are only being discovered now, meaning the genetic legacy inside modern humans may be more varied and more widespread than anyone assumed even 5 years ago. Put all of that together, and the old textbook framing, Neanderthals lived, then Neanderthals went extinct, then modern humans took over, starts to look less like an ending and more like an incomplete sentence. There's also a geographic piece of this worth sitting with, because it changes how you should picture the legacy distributed across the planet today. Neanderthal ancestry isn't spread evenly across every population. Outside Africa, East Asian populations carry noticeably more Neanderthal DNA than European populations do, a pattern researchers believe reflects multiple separate waves of interbreeding as modern humans spread eastward across Eurasia over thousands of years, rather than one single mixing event. Meanwhile, Denisovan ancestry, DNA from a related distinct population, identified from a single cave in Siberia's Altai Mountains, shows up far more prominently in populations across Oceania, including Papua New Guinea and Australia, in some cases making up close to 5% of the genome. The genetic map of who absorbed which ancient population and how much is not a single story. It's dozens of overlapping regional stories, each written into the DNA of the people living there today. If you've made it this far, you've already got a more complete picture of this than most textbooks bothered to give people even 5 years ago. In the next part of this, we get into exactly what has been proven, and just as importantly, what hasn't. Because the responsible version of this story is more interesting than an exaggerated one, not less. Before going any further, this is the point in the story where it's worth slowing down and being precise about exactly what has and has not been proven, because a claim this large deserves exactly that kind of care. To be absolutely clear, no scientist involved in any of this research is claiming that living Neanderthals exist somewhere, or that Neanderthals as a distinct self-sustaining population survived past roughly 40,000 years ago as a separate lineage with their own communities, their own technology, and their own evolutionary path. Neanderthals did go extinct. That part of the original story remains true and is not in dispute. What has changed is the understanding of what extinction actually meant for them. Rather than vanishing without a trace, a meaningful portion of their genetic material was absorbed into the population that replaced them, and that material did not simply persist as dead weight. It continued and continues to actively influence the biology of the descendants who carry it. This is population-level genetic evidence, drawn from broad genomic comparisons across thousands of individuals, not proof about any single-name person or lineage. Nobody is claiming your specific ancestor has been identified or tested individually. The evidence describes an inherited pattern across entire populations, which is a different, and in some ways more powerful, kind of proof than any single skeleton could ever provide. It's also worth being honest that the science here is still actively moving, not settled and filed away. The Berkeley team's ghost ancestor findings are new enough that follow-up research is still underway to determine exactly which ancient populations those unidentified genetic signatures belong to. The Stajnia cave findings out of Poland describe one previously unknown Neanderthal lineage, and researchers have been clear that more hidden populations like it likely remain undiscovered across Eurasia. And the growth hormone receptor study, while peer-reviewed, describes an association between a Neanderthal-derived gene variant and developmental differences, a real measured statistical relationship, not a simple single-cause explanation for how any one person's body developed. Genetics rarely deals in clean, single-gene answers, and this field is no exception. It's worth adding one more layer of caution here too, because even the sex-biased interbreeding finding from the University of Pennsylvania team doesn't answer every question it raises. The study establishes a clear statistical pattern, a striking imbalance in how Neanderthal and modern human DNA distributed across the X chromosome, and offers a social explanation rooted in which group's descendants were typically raised within which community as the most likely cause. But the researchers themselves are working from population-level genetic patterns preserved across tens of thousands of years, not from written records, direct observation, or individually documented relationships. It's a compelling, well-supported inference built on hard genomic evidence, not a witnessed account of ancient social behavior. That distinction matters, and any honest telling of this story has to hold on to it. There's one more thread worth pulling before this closes, because it changes how you should think about every future headline on this topic. Ancient DNA research is still a young field, barely 20 years old in its modern form, and every tool used in this video, genome sequencing, ancestry mapping, the ghost population technique out of Berkeley, has gotten dramatically more sensitive in just the last 5 years. That means the current picture, detailed as it is very likely incomplete. The 2 unidentified ancient populations Berkeley researchers detected this year were invisible to every genetic study that came before, not because they weren't there, but because the instruments weren't sharp enough yet to see them. There is no reason to assume this is where the detection stops. If 2 hidden ancestors could remain undiscovered until 2026, the honest expectation is that more are still sitting in the data, waiting on the next improvement in technique to finally surface. So here's where that leaves the story you opened with. Neanderthals did not survive extinction the way a hidden population survives in a remote valley, undiscovered and untouched. That version of the story was never real, and no responsible scientist is claiming it now. But the version that replaces it is, in its own way, more remarkable. Their genes did not go extinct. They dispersed quietly into the bodies of the population that outlived them, carried forward not as a curiosity frozen in amber, but as active, functioning biology, still shaping immune systems, still shaping growth, still shaping the people. Reading this sentence right now, examined and confirmed by scientists using tools that didn't exist 20 years ago. Extinction, it turns out, was never a clean ending. It was a merger nobody wrote down at the time, and one that modern genetics is only now finally reading back. So tell me in the comments which part of this surprised you more, that a Neanderthal growth hormone gene is still active in people alive today, or that scientists are still finding entirely new, previously unknown Neanderthal groups hidden in caves like Stajnia that nobody had ever genetically sampled before.